Afternoon, colleagues. It's very nice to see you all. Thanks for coming. You are in the place to think through the cutting edge issues of higher education, and I'm really excited about the lecture that we have today. My name is Rawdon Wilkinson, and I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Education and Student Experience. I think many of you know me. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the lands from which I join you all on today. I'm on Bedagal and Gadigal land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders both past and present, and also extend my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are with us today. Please do all acknowledge the lands that you are on in the chat. That would be very nice to see. So today we have, I think, a really exciting lecture presentation. This, I think, is the topic that has animated many of our conversations about higher education in the last 20 months. And it's about the lecture. And Melanie White, who's going to walk us through this, her lecture title is Long Live the Lecture. And I think it's really nice to have that kind of intervention in debate. We've heard an awful lot about lectures being, the end of the lecture being reached, about the reconfiguration of lectures. And we're really, I think, very privileged to have Melanie walk us through this conversation. So Melanie, I'd like to welcome you to the Scientia lecture series. Melanie, I'm sure many of you know, is an Associate Professor of Sociology in ADA at UNSW Sydney. She's also the Deputy Head of the School of Education and has been a Fellow of the UNSW Scientia Education Academy since 2018. She's won several awards for her teaching and is very committed to enhancing the student experience by using experimental techniques to transform her lectures into sites of active learning. Her research and teaching is in classical and contemporary social theory, with a particular interest in non-human sociality, habit, creativity, and sympathy. And as I mentioned, her lecture is on Long Live the Lecture. So Melanie, without further ado, and colleagues, just to remind you that this is being recorded. Welcome, Melanie, and over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rawdon, for your introduction. I will share my screen. And I hope that everyone is seeing the screen. I'm delighted to be speaking to you today about this particular topic, the lecture. My title to the lecture would have given away my stance already. I hope to show you that indeed the lecture lives long, and I hope to give it a long, healthy life. I'm sitting here in my office in Morven Brown building on campus. And if I look outside on the quad on the campus grounds, there's a beautiful magnolia tree right beside me. I can smell the earth from the recent rains. And all of this makes me appreciate that I'm speaking to you on Bedagal land. And so I'd like to acknowledge the Bedagal people of the Eora Nation on whose land I'm speaking, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who have joined me today. Thank you for having me. Now, the title of my lecture is Long Live the Lecture, and it has already done significant work in articulating my commitment to a model of teaching that many would claim and have claimed is old-fashioned, outdated, and no longer relevant for students and educators in the 21st century. Of course, I don't believe it is. And my aim in this lecture is to tell you why, if not to persuade you that it is a viable and necessary way of teaching and learning in the social sciences and humanities, if not the university writ large. Now, currently in Australia, lectures are seemingly under threat. 2 weeks ago, Campus Morning Mail announced that it was lights out for the lecture at the University of the Sunshine Coast, and that was on September 28th. In February 2021, the Australian Association for Research and Education ran a spot titled, "Is the Lecture Dead? Is it Instagram worthy? Memorable?" And last year, ABC News announced that Curtin University was planning to ditch in-person lectures even after the pandemic ends. Now, these announcements would seem to be, a function of post-pandemic nerves, unless they are situated in relation to pre-COVID judgments in Australia, North America, and the UK. In 2015, for example, Warren Bebbington, the former Vice Chancellor of the University of Adelaide, announced that, quote, "Lectures are obsolete. My view is that they're gone. They are never coming back." It may be worthwhile noting that Bebbington has since retired from his office, and lectures still abound at the University of Adelaide. Internationally, the Chronicle of Higher Education in the US publishes frequent spots on the status of the lecture. This is but one example. Furthermore, an op-ed piece in The Guardian has called the lecture rubbish and have nothing to do with teaching. Quote, "They should have gone out when printing was invented and students learned to read," end quote. And lastly, the Times Higher Education Bulletin has weighed in. The lecture is dead, long live the lecture, undecided, but still part of the debate. So certainly this discussion is far from one-sided. To each proclamation that the lecture is dead, others appear, seeking to defend the lecture, to praise its virtues, and to restore it to its rightful place. And here are just some representatives. From the Chronicle of Higher Education, an opinion piece in the New York Times by Molly Worthen, an excellent article by Mia Tokomitsu in defense of the lecture published in the Jacobin, and most recently, on September 30th, the lovely Shirley Scott sent me this link to an active learning forum published in Science, which when you scroll all the way to the bottom, one finds an e-letter by Brian Key from the University of Queensland in defense of the lecture. Now, to return to my objectives in the lecture, you already know where I stand vis-a-vis the lecture in this debate. And I suppose the more interesting question at this point is why? To address this question, I think, requires us to consider a more interesting one, which is why lectures are under attack in the first place. And of course, there are many different reasons, among them the idea that this generation of students are digitally oriented, tech savvy, and because of this are allergic to lectures. Now, certainly it is true. Lectures can be boring. And certainly some lectures and their lectures can be didactic and exhibit little consideration for their students or their audience. To my mind, there is no better representation of the boar at the boar than is found in the iconic film Ferris Bueller's Day Off, 1986, directed by John Hughes.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the Great Depression, passed the the tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act.
Now, for Bruce Charlton, who wrote this piece for The Guardian in 2015, and I suspect for many, if not all of us, such lectures as depicted in the Ferris Bueller film are a travesty. For Charlton, he says lectures are, quote, vast, stuffy venues that seat hundreds, students sitting in the dark, unable to see the speaker, a disembodied voice droning into the microphone, the lecturer reading out endless PowerPoint slides which have already been posted online. the audience passive instead of actively making their own notes, distracted by themselves and others, intermittently browsing the internet and social networks, and the whole thing being recorded as if to emphasize to students that they don't really need to be there nor pay attention. To me, this is crushing. And all I can think is, oh dear, this is the problem in a nutshell. Certainly not all lecturers are gifted orators, and at times we may take refuge in tried and true methods of waiting it out, such as reading verbatim from our PowerPoint slides, participate in excessive indulgent digression, and lose track of time. But I think that the real issue here is the assumption that lectures merely transmit knowledge or information, thereby creating a passive student learning experience. Now, of course, it was Paulo Freire who, in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, vilified the transmission model of education. He argued that the transmission model of education basically squeezes the life force out of the learning experience. Quote, "The teacher talks about reality as if it were motionless, static, compartmentalized, and predictable, or else he or she or they expounds on a topic completely alien to the existential experience of the students." End quote. In sum, the content is abstracted and alien, with the effect of transforming what could be a dynamic and relational experience of learning into a siloed experience in which students are receptacles to be filled by the teacher. And I must confess, I love this image of the funnel pouring in concrete as the head is opened up to receive the wisdom. Now, certainly universities have become aware of the limits of the transmission model, insofar as there have been countless studies that show that they produce poor learning outcomes. Here is one example. In a 2014 study, Freeman et al. Conducted a meta-analysis of 225 studies that examined the effectiveness of traditional lectures versus active learning in undergraduate STEM courses. And they found that lecturing increased failure rates by 55%. Active learning or teaching methods that were more interactive than traditional lectures resulted in better grades and a 36% drop in class failure rates. With this kind of evidence, I'll admit, things don't look particularly good for the lecture. But I can't help but wonder if there is a disciplinary difference being played up here, and certainly being played out in these debates. It may well be that the traditional lectures may support student learning in STEM-based disciplines such as science, mathematics, and engineering. This isn't my disciplinary background, and I have no expertise in these areas, save for helping my daughter study for her yearly exams, but of course this doesn't count. But this isn't the case for the disciplines in the social sciences and humanities. And so it's led me to think that where the debate founders is with the assumption that lectures are by necessity passive learning spaces. Now, of course, they can be, but equally they can be otherwise. They can be incredibly versatile spaces of dialogue, exchange, and learning for both teacher and student. And so, in short, my aim is to make a case for the lecture by contesting this second point, the second point that I bolded here, namely that lectures merely transmit knowledge or information, thereby creating a passive student learning experience. This is my claim in a nutshell. I want to argue that the stigmatization of the lecture is the result of a profound misunderstanding of what a lecture is, its relation to active learning, and its capacity to generate a positive student experience along with strong learning outcomes, at least in the social sciences and humanities. Moreover, I want to show that there is something really special about the lecture that distinguishes it as a form of meaning-making, pedagogical experience, and knowledge production that makes it intrinsically valuable. Now, as Rorden mentioned, I'm a sociologist, and my expertise is in classical and contemporary theory. My current research concerns the emergence of the concept of the social as a distinct object of analysis. It serves to do what I seek to impart to my students, which is to make the familiar, that is, the social, unfamiliar. And indeed, as I reflected in my preparation for this lecture, I think this is what my aim is here with this lecture on the lecture, namely to make us reflect upon and rethink what we understand the lecture to be, that is a space of passive learning and transmission, to make that understanding, that sense of the lecture, unfamiliar, and consequently to intervene and to change the discourse around the lecture. For me personally, the lecture invites one into relation with others, and accordingly, it is a complex space of interaction. Now, the famous sociologist Erving Goffman calls the lecture, quote, an institutionalized, extended holding forth of the floor, in which one speaker, here in this instance, me, imparts their views on a subject, and these thoughts comprise what is called the text. The lecture requires an audience, that is a group of listeners who have the right to hold the whole of the speaker's body in the focus of staring at attention, as they would an entertainer, and who initially at least have only the back channel through which to convey their response. Certainly in face-to-face lectures, this may take the form of students covering their mouths and whispering to a peer next to them, or writing a note on their foolscap. But in a recorded lecture, of course, this back channel is also evident. It's evident in the sense of communications behind the scene. How is she going? What is she doing? What is she saying and why, etc. Now, if I take this to heart and reflect on my own situatedness, I can think about my relationship. Here you see an image now. I am neither an engineer nor a scientist nor a medical scholar, nor would it seem to me that I have a future in art and design, and so I apologize to my colleagues. This is a rendition of me, Melanie, and here I am in relation with my students. And this relationship is something, I think, that can't be taken for granted. It's a relationship that extends beyond me and them, beyond me and you, and extends to include the text under examination, the text of which I speak, and the relationship that I have with myself while I communicate the ground of the text. And in my image here, I have Max Weber, one of the founding sociologists in Germany here. And all of us are engaged in our relationship with the text. All of these relations, to myself, my expectations of the lecture, to my students, my expectation of their comportment and their understanding and engagement, their expectations of me, and of my capacity to illuminate the text, to bring it to life for them, requires and demands a responsibility. It demands a responsibility and attention. Any failure to do so, that is, to be responsible, to be attentive, results in an unsatisfactory experience for both student and lecturer. We know when we leave the lecture hall that we've done a good job. We know equally when we've done a poor job. But one of the marvelous things about teaching is that you can show up following week and try it all again. To me, lecturing is one of the most honest professions, second perhaps only to hairdressing, I would imagine, in which you know you have succeeded insofar as your audience keeps coming back. My view is that to cultivate these relationships, to ensure that they are nurtured, requires an attention to extend beyond the text of the lecture itself, beyond the text under examination, to reflect on what prior knowledge students may have in order to work collaboratively, to decipher, to interpret, and to make sense of a text. But crucially, to do so in a way that maintains student engagement by demonstrating the relevance of an argument to their lived experience. These are my commitments, but they may not do as much as I would like to persuade you that the lecture is a dynamic space, one that is not simply a site of passive learning. I'm acutely aware that I'm sitting here in my office, alone in front of a screen that is recording this lecture, that many of you are listening, I hope, attentively to my words. But I think beyond that, even notwithstanding the fact of this being a recorded lecture, is that I think the task I've set myself, that is to lecture on the lecture, involves a certain degree of abstraction. In a usual lecture that I would prepare for my students in my field of study, I could present a problem confronting the 19th century sociologist Emile Durkheim in the development of his attempt to claim that social facts are things. I would be able to demonstrate how or why that mattered, the ripple effects of his contributions for sociology in France, and in fact for the establishment of the discipline over the world. I would be able to show you, my students, how his conception of society continues to resonate with contemporary scholars, such that we are continually engaging, reimagining, and challenging his work to move the discipline forward. Of course, I could discuss Durkheim, but to do so would neglect my audience. It would neglect you, and it would neglect my contract with you, that is to persuade you that lectures are not strictly the purview of dull, monotonous, self-regarding reflection. The challenge is that lecturing on the lecture seems somehow artificial, but it is also prone to failure. As Goffman says, it is apparent, quote, that lecturing on lectures is nonetheless a little special. To hold forth on an extended fashion on lecturing to persons while they must sit through one is to force them to serve double time, a cruel and unusual punishment, end quote. And that quotation is taken from his Forms of Talk, in which he reflects upon the lecture. And indeed, he, like me, lectures on the lecture. Now, this particular occasion is not without its challenges. Not only may the audience feel that they are doing double time, but I feel that there is a real risk of reproducing precisely those elements that those who wish the lecture dead would revile. So my dilemma is how to avoid this. A crucial element of lecturing for me is that its preparation must be thoughtful and in so doing be meaningful. It is a community event, and here in this context, to make a case for the power of the lecture in the social sciences and humanities, it only makes sense to give voice to my community. That is, those with whom I am in relation, my colleagues, my students. I wondered in preparing for this lecture, this occasion, if I could extend an invitation to my colleagues to participate in this community endeavor. I wondered if they too hold the same view of my lecture as I do. Indeed, we never really talk about lecturing. So much of our time is spent working away privately on the things that matter to us, to our students, to preparing material, to research, to making the university run. And so I wondered, I reflected, I actually didn't know how my colleagues viewed the lecture. Was it a deadening artifact of medieval learning, or was it a dynamic space? Did they perceive anything of value in the lecture? And if so, what makes it special? And so in preparation for this lecture, on the lecture, I invited colleagues in the School of Social Sciences, my school, to engage in a conversation with me about the lecture. I wanted to invite my colleagues to have a voice and to discuss, and indeed to challenge that kind of passive transmission model in an effort to cultivate a context for conversation, debate, and to find out how and what they do in their classrooms. I invited those colleagues who lecture in large first or second year classes, and they all kindly consented. And lucky for me, they agreed to have our conversations recorded so that I could share them with you. So with this in mind, I asked my colleagues two questions. I didn't want to presume that their conception of the lecture would be the same as my own. So I asked them, what is a lecture? If indeed an alien from outer space would come and visit a lecture as it was happening, how would they know that this was indeed a lecture? What defines it, in other words? And the second question is, from my colleagues' perspectives, what is distinctive, even special, about the lecture as a mode of teaching delivery? In other words, what does lecturing allow one to do in the classroom that is irreducible to tutorials, to flipped classrooms, and otherwise? Now, I must confess, I was so excited about this project because the conversations were illuminating. We discussed pedagogy, we discussed pedagogical philosophy, and it was so very enjoyable to find out what my colleagues do in the classroom. And in this context, I offer some snippets of our conversation about the lecture to assist me, to support me, to demonstrate the relation that I'm in order to facilitate this lecture on the lecture. I do so again deliberately in order to disrupt the assumption that lecturing is by its very nature a transmission, a self-regarding domain of the expert with little regard for audience, and to offer an opportunity to reflect and debate and discuss what makes lecturing so special. And I do so also to offer a sense of the commitment to lecturing that my colleagues, I was delighted to find, share with me. So to the question, what is a lecture? Here is my colleague, Diana Perch, who teaches in social policy.
Well, look, I'll give it a go. When I think of a lecture, I'm usually thinking of a type of teaching where the lecturer is in the position of having prepared the material very carefully in order to present it in a very particular way and in a particular order to the students. And it's often described as being unidirectional in the sense that the lecturer does the talking and the students do the listening. That's not usually my experience of lectures. Lectures often raise opportunities for the students to ask questions and to interrupt and to seek clarification. But the difference between a lecture and a tutorial is that the lecture is about giving the lecturer the space and the time to guide the students through a topic or a set of material in a way where the lecturer is controlling the order in which the material is discussed. And the lecturer is essentially providing a pathway through the material. So I often think of lectures as a way of introducing students to a set of material it's like presenting a map. It's like presenting a particular pathway through the complex topic, whether it's a complex set of readings or key authors or a social issue which is going to be explored or some kind of theoretical concept. Whatever it is, the lecturer is setting out a pathway with signposts and points of interest and warnings and advice about the confusing and complex areas that might be there for the student to have to stumble over. There's a lot in terms of the lecturer giving advice about how to approach this particular topic or this particular material.
What Diana captures in her statement is the commitment to careful preparation. The particularity of which she speaks refers to the sense in which one chooses how to best animate discussion, articulate the relevance of a specific issue, and to motivate an appreciation of the complexity of the problem at hand. Her commentary reflects the care, the considered attention, and the expertise required to lead students. The preparation involves a means of imparting foundational knowledge and situating it in relation to disciplinary debates, directions, and challenges. But of course, one might observe the danger that such organized modes of talk, I'm recalling the definition that Goffman gives us of the lecture, may well lend themselves to passive learning. But Alison Wannon, who teaches alongside Diana in social policy, observes that this is a thing that is perhaps of the past.
The lectures today, certainly my approach is how to involve the students in learning and for that interaction to be part of the way a lecture happens. And so it's just not a didactic, and here comes the information, but it's about how you build a learning community. I know it's an overused word, but I think it's possible in lectures.
What Alison highlights in her commitment to the student experience, in her commitment to active learning, is that through the guidance of the lecture, to facilitate the educational journey of students within the classroom, lecturing can involve a degree of active learning. Certainly this is true for me. Lecturing consists in creating the conditions for a successful educational journey. The lecturer has access to the whole itinerary, so to speak, and utilizing Diana's map, the itinerary helps to set out the course of study in a supported, resourced manner. We have the learning outcomes at root in terms of having access to the whole topic, the whole debate, the whole arena of knowledge that we're seeking to impart to students. And as a lecturer, what we do then is to construct a narrative arc that situates the topic in relation to the discipline, the particular aims and outcomes of the course under study, and also to mobilize this in relation to the way that other thinkers reflect on that topic, challenge that topic, either aggressively or not so aggressively. My colleague, Nick Apoifis, who teaches in politics and international relations, reflects on the experience of the lecture from the standpoint of the student engaged in this educational journey.
For me, a lecture is an educational journey, but it's a mechanism to tell a story. It's a tool that we use to tell longer forms of stories. But at the end of it, you'll walk out going, that's caused me some problems, or yes, I agree, or I detest that. And I can't do that without that sort of longer form journey storytelling, like a little novella, let's say.
I love that, like a little novella. Now, lectures are certainly challenging spaces, and they are challenging from the perspective of student experience because such lectures in social science and humanities are not a recitation of facts, but rather reflect the building of an argument that is situated in a contested space of multiple perspectives, points of view, some more effective, some less effective, but all approaches to resolving a practical or intellectual problem. In other words, lectures actively build a relationship for students between different elements of thought in a given discipline. My colleague, Fengxi Wu, offers some very nice observations about the contested nature of scholarship and research within the social sciences that easily extends to the humanities.
Every student is unique. They're different in terms of their knowledge background, their experiences in life. And as in social science, almost every concept is contested. And also the interpretations needs to be activated. Right? The concepts in texts are fixed, but the way to explain it to a lively classroom differs from time to time and case to case. So this is a necessary step in any learning process with social science, that students are in a place, in a time, together.
Now, from this vantage, what we can see is the multiple way in which concepts, ideas, etc., are challenged, that concepts and ideas take on different forms, different contexts, etc. And of course, lectures impart facts, but in the course of modeling argumentation about those facts, they respond to nonverbal cues of the audience. For me, it's a bit challenging in the sense that I can't see you, I can't feel the energy, I can't see perhaps the dismissive shake of the head, or the finger pointing up, or the nod of enthusiasm. In this sense, lectures, when they are synchronous, when they are face-to-face in this fashion, they are controlled yet dynamic. The process of this controlled dynamism inculcates an opportunity to facilitate the learning experience. Lectures are indeed challenging spaces, and they are challenging from the perspective of student experiences because, again, it's not strictly a recitation of student, a recitation of fact. Now, certainly, lectures involve careful preparation. spontaneous revelation, even when that revelation is orchestrated. Mia Tokomitsu, in her article in defense of the lecture, notes that even while speaking with students, engaging their reactions, lecturers come to new conclusions, incorporate them into their own lecture, and refine their argument. It is not strictly the preparation of the lecture that is an intellectual exercise, but so too the delivery. And it's in this context that one of the tremendous values of the lecture for social sciences and humanities students and scholars is that they model argumentation and complexity. Diana makes some nice observations about the importance of modeling argumentation and demonstrating complexity in this context.
Makes
Melanie,
sure
5 minutes.
Understand that the answer is never as simple as they thought it was at the start of the lecture, that there's always more to explore. And that's something that you can do in a sustained exposition of a lecture, but it's harder to do in a short tutorial or in a short group discussion. I think it's really important for us as lecturers to model that argumentation, because it's what we expect our students to do when they write essays. And it's not necessarily something that is obvious when you read a journal article for a student to see. But when we're going through a lecture, if we are modeling that kind of critical argumentation and the critical thinking skills, that helps them to see as we talk our way through it, helps them to see what it is that we're expecting them to do when they approach the material that we're talking about in the course.
Now, modeling argumentation about these facts allows and is facilitated by those nonverbal cues that I mentioned moments ago. Those nonverbal cues are indications of an interest in participating in conversation and discussion. This experience, this process, is a reflection of the inculcation of critical thinking skills within the audience that do not emerge fully formed, but in fact develop over time. And that long form of the lecture helps to generate this kind of critical thinking. Such skills enable students to distinguish argument from preference or opinion, and to interrogate simple word of mouth. They see how ideas are interrogated not simply by the lecturer, but also by their peers. They experience doubt, they question, they challenge, and ultimately, critically, they think.
We champion that we want to bring up the younger generation as critical thinkers. And in the lecture component, this is the time for the instructor to demonstrate what is critical thinking, to demonstrate how to establish an argument, how to refute an argument, how to contrast different arguments, how to present different arguments in a way and tease out the nuances, the different aspects. Why some arguments, non-arguments are always true or always wrong. We're not in the field of truth. We're in the field of research and dilemmas and difficult questions and faced with multiple possible answers. So this is the opportunity for the instructor to perform what critical thinking is, how to do it.
Now, sitting in a lecture, better attending a lecture, is hard work. It requires one to focus, to pay attention, to absorb long, complex arguments. But through the lecture, students learn to synthesize material, to organize it, and to respond to it as they listen. Active listening is a crucial component of the educational experience, and indeed a reflection of a process of active learning and engagement. Here is my colleague Joyce Wu who offers a wonderful reflection on the importance of active listening as intimately connected with thinking.
Makes lectures special is that lectures, when delivered by inspiring people, can have a way of making knowledges and learning as an empowering process for the listener. Listening to a lecture can be a very private, almost like a internal ongoing reflection or a dialogue between hearing from what the person is saying and then processing it, you know, in your interior self from both the head and the heart. And I think that is what makes going to an inspiring lecture means for me.
In teaching students that listening is important, the lecture helps to cultivate an inner world that facilitates analytical work. It generates focus, concentration, and mindfulness that in the process teaches students of the emotional stakes of the intellectual domain in which they find themselves. The lecture helps to cultivate the connection of student to lecturer, student to the text, and ultimately the text to their own lives. The importance of communicating the emotional vitality of the intellectual endeavor cannot be underestimated. And here is Nicopoiphis again.
In the literature has been interested for a long time in the way emotions work and space works and the physicality of the things around you. And I can't escape that when we're looking at a lecture. For me, it's the physicality, it's the location, it's the where you sit, it's the people around you, and it's the emotional connections and feelings and interactions that you have in that moment, in that theatre, right? Like imagine your first year, you've never engaged with the university at all, and you sit outside, you stand outside the lecture theatre before it starts, and you interact with your cohorts, you speak to your fellow students about nothing and everything. And then you walk into a theatre where you interact with people in a different context. The moment you get in, you're like, this is learning. There's a person out there. I have to listen, but what do I do in that relationship? Can I disagree? Can I agree? So all of that plays out in that space.
Ultimately, what the lecture succeeds in, beyond skill building and intellectual capacity, is the broad experience of belonging to the class, to a program, to the broader community of the university, along with research and scholarship. If I had more time, I would share with you some wonderful observations by my colleague Marie Higgins. And moreover, I would go on to discuss the extent to which lectures can have a transformative experience. My goal in my lecturing and in the experience of my colleagues is to move lecturing and the experience of attending simply from being there to experiencing and anticipating something will happen that one doesn't want to miss. And it's this emphasis on transformation that is crucial to anyone's learning journey. My colleague Nama Carlin, who teaches in the sociology and anthropology program, had some lovely things that I would want to share. But in the interests of time, I will bring my talk to a close. And again, my overall aim here was to persuade you that there is something really special about the lecture that distinguishes it as a form of meaning making, pedagogical experience and knowledge production that makes it intrinsically valuable. Your questions and comments will tell me if I'm successful. And so I want to say thank you very much.
Thank you, Melanie. That was terrific. Really fantastic and very thought-provoking. Colleagues, please do put your questions in the chat or raise your hand if you would like to ask Melanie a question. While you do that, Melanie, I should apologise because I, of course, introduced you as Deputy Head of the School of Education, and you're not. You're Deputy Head of the School of Social Sciences, so my apologies for that. While people put questions in the chat or raise their hand, I have to say I had a whole series of questions that came to my mind, so if I might jump in and ask you one. And the last video clip you showed really reinforced, I think, the curiosity I have in this question, and it's about the relationship between the lecture and the space in which it takes place. Because, you know, you make a powerful argument about the lecturer's text, your own positionality and ours within it, how to disrupt meaning by making it unfamiliar. But to what and you've given a lecture online, to what extent is the space in which we deliver those lectures really contingent on the meaning that those lectures have?
Thank you. I think that this is a fabulous question, and certainly this is the core question that animated my experiment in offering this lecture today. Certainly, as would be evident, I am committed to lecturing. I love the in-person lecture. I love the opportunity of being able to invite students to participate actively in a face-to-face context unmediated by screen. And what I've come, and so I was hopeful that I might even be able to offer this lecture in person. And the reason is because it was easier. In some ways, it is easier partly because I'm more comfortable with knowing how to modulate my voice, to pose a question, to be attentive to my audience, to ask the right question, to prepare in such a way that I'm comfortable and familiar with developing that narrative art to facilitate that entanglement of emotion and intellectual acuity. And I think that one of the experiences and perhaps opportunities of the pandemic has been to force perhaps dinosaurs like me to think about the way in which the recorded lecture space can also be a creative medium, and a creative medium that requires new techniques, new skills, new ways of facilitating that kind of dialogue that isn't strictly transmission, but to demonstrate and make possible a kind of conversation in a different way. And that's certainly what I attempt to do in my lecture today. I was very fearful that in espousing an argument that says, the lecture is not a transmission model, it is not simply one person standing and holding forth, that I might be judged by doing precisely that in the context of the lecture. So it became incumbent upon me to be creative, to find a way to meet the needs of my audience here, that is all of you listening today, and to try and mimic or facilitate a broader conversation in that community through other means. And so what that involved was having lovely conversations with my colleagues, and thankfully they agreed to record for the purposes of this exercise. But what it's shown me is that it requires a different kind of effort, different kind of skills, different kinds of techniques to realize the potential of the lecture.
Thank you, Melanie. That's a terrific answer. Timothy, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Rawdon. And thank you, Melanie. That was absolutely wonderful. I'm really happy I'd carved out this 1 hour at my lunchtime to listen to this. It was really, really great. Look, the question, it's not really a question, it's more a comment. I mean, that's such a rich set of perspectives you've given us. And so many things are kind of happening in my mind, thinking about, I guess, analogies and reverberations of that. And I'm thinking about it in all of that focus on the kind of, first of all, some of the people you spoke to, your colleagues, talked about the narrative, the story. This is a larger kind of story than would happen maybe in a 10-minute bit at the beginning of a tutorial, or in relation to one little bit of text that assembles things together. And I was thinking about this in relation to the way you can think about, say, about film, and about how a director will take you in. It's a long form. It's not your 28, 27-minute episode On Netflix, it's a long form. It might be 2 hours long, and they slow you down, perhaps, depending on what you're watching. It can happen in a novel when you read a novel. A novelist is going to slow you down or speed you up and bring your attention to certain things, and then bring your attention to something else. And it's the same thing with music, of course, whether it's a 2.5-minute pop song or a 45-minute long symphony. Different things can be done within different time frames. And I think focusing on that is really interesting, just that focus on the lecture. The lecture is a format in which you guide the attention of the students in different ways and set up and model something for the students in terms of putting things together. And it takes time to do that. And the time, so even if you were like, as in some universities, staff are encouraged to reduce their lectures or to chop up their lectures into, say, a 20-minute pod, and you do that 20 minutes and that's downloadable by students because, well, I only have 20 minutes. Well, it's like, actually, for some things, we need you to make more than 20 minutes available, right? That there are some things for which that's important, that can achieve something in that time frame that you can't in a much shorter time frame, as you kind of illustrated today. I just think, in terms of the way you presented, I think that was a great, also your lecture was exemplifying that, the necessity of unfolding those things, bringing in the different perspectives, and it has a certain cumulative effect at the end of it, which could not have been achieved in other, in a shorter format. But then that raises the question that Roden's already talked about, and that Nick in the final clip talked about the experience of a lecture theatre. So there's also, because when you go, there's the difference, say, with a film between you go to the cinema or you watch it online, right? The cinema, there's a certain experience in that. You're cut off from the world, you're sitting in the dark, you're not talking to anyone. It makes, your attention is different. So I wonder if that's, because I think a lot of the discussion also about, the death of the lecture is also about, as we've seen, about the death of the face-to-face lecture. It's making the lecture into a commodity that's easily consumable by students on their own time in their own place, right? Rather than making it some kind of event where it's, no, you need to buy into this, you invest time to get here, you sit in this environment. So how important are those elements? Again, the question about putting together the physical aspect with it. How important is that?
Melanie, can I add something to that? Because Karen put something in the chat that's related, and it's about the time as well allocated to the lecture. Timothy talked about that when he was talking about chunking things up. Karen writes, and Karen, you're on screen now, but if you don't mind, I'll read this for you. How large a role does, you were going to ask how large a role does space or location play, but as an extension of that, how does allocated time influence our experience and preparation of a lecture?
All of these are marvelous, marvelous comments and marvelous questions. I think my sense is that there is a particular form, and I mean this in the formal sense, of what can be usefully and sustainably accomplished in a 1-hour lecture, in a 30-minute lecture. Let's even go back, let's shrink the time frame. What can be accomplished in a 10 or 15-minute soundbite vis-a-vis a 30-minute, 1-hour, 2-hour, etc. And I'm not sure that I would want to stipulate what the sweet spot for the lecture is, because I would want to identify what are the aims of the given learning exercise. How much time does it need? Certainly reading and digesting and providing some exegetical observations of the texts in my discipline require an extended time that wouldn't simply be, would not be possible to digest in the chunking model, chunking it up 15 minutes here. Okay, so this is the first paragraph of Foucault's Discipline and Punish. There we go, moving on. So that wouldn't necessarily be possible, but I think that, I guess I'm coming to the view that online lectures and face-to-face lectures both have their particular expectations, they have their particular rhythms, and they have the different kinds of relationships that an effective lecturer will need to take into account in order to take the perspective of the other. That is, the other that is listening. What are they hoping for? What are they wanting to achieve? And the metric of success will be a function of how in tune, or the level of attunement between lecturer and student to determine whether or not that's been successful. I think, so that's one observation. I wanted to come back to Timothy, your question about the event. And I think personally, one of the shortcomings of our experience with recorded lectures is that they are insufficiently social. And by that, a student can, certainly they're convenient and all the rest, a student can attend a lecture in the comfort of their own home, and then the lecture ends and it's done. There's no one to debrief with. There's no one to talk with. There isn't anyone to walk out of the lecture hall and say, oh, what did you think of that? Did you think that that comment was interesting? This is what I wanted to say. And one might presume that it would be possible to extend those types of conversations on social media or otherwise, or on Teams forums. I think that more support for students to find out how to support that kind of investigation, that kind of questioning post-lecture would be really effective, because I think that the recording experience is one where the narrative starts and it's like in those old celluloid films, and suddenly the film it disintegrates before your very eyes and it's done. That's it. And so I guess what I'm trying to convey is that sense of embedding these lectures that we hold in whatever forum and whatever context in a broader community, so that there is support to be able to reinforce the learning and the experience of the student.
Thank you, Melanie. Colleagues, that was terrific. I'm afraid we're out of time and we could talk about this for a very long time. So thank you very much, Melanie. Colleagues, there will be a questionnaire that goes out. Please do fill it in, please, so that we can share feedback. Melanie, I hope we can carry on this conversation again in other forums as well to reinstate that social element, because I think you provoked an awful lot of interest. I know Alex and others were also wanting to ask a question, but we couldn't because we ran out of time. So thank you again. Thank you, colleagues, all for coming. Be safe, be well, enjoy Recharge Week next week. See you soon.
Great. Thank you, everyone.